Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining our session today. Like many sessions at Charleston this year, we're going to be talking about how attitudes and actions towards open access and big deal contracts looked right before the pandemic, and we'll be offering some suggestions for how we might move forward from here in a productive way. My name is Joelle Pitts. I'm the Associate Dean for Administration, Planning, and Assessment at Carnegie Mellon University Libraries. And I am joined today by Angie Oler, who is currently the Associate Dean for Content and Digital Initiatives at the University of Arkansas, headed there recently from the University of Maryland, where she was the Director of Collection Services. And if you've not done so already, we'd invite you to please take our short survey about how you and your institution are handling these issues right now. Tell us where you're heading in the months to come. We will bring up the results of this survey at the end of the presentation today, and we'll keep this link on each of the next few slides so we can keep moving through the content. And I'm going to have Angie click through the slides for me so that we don't have to pass the baton back and forth too much today. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so COVID-19 has obviously created a distinct divergence from the norm for so many of us. From closed stacks and book quarantines to budget cuts and staff layoffs, we are, as a community, tired and even fearful of what's to come. And Angie and I believe that this pandemic has really created two viewpoints or approaches among our academic library colleagues. Those who are simply waiting for the pandemic to be over and for things to go back to normal, and those who are going to at least attempt to leverage this moment in time as an opportunity. And this is, for Angie and I, we're pretty firmly in the second camp, I think, obviously, with this presentation. But we're going to try and highlight some of the ways we think that we might be able to leverage this time to make real change, to make meaningful change. So next slide, please. All right, so to set the stage, I will remind everyone what the landscape was looking like in the few months before the pandemic. Likely this audience is acutely aware of this landscape already, but since 2019 feels like it was 1,000 years ago, here we go. The first one likely resonates the most. Big deals are getting harder and harder for us to maintain with constant inflation and flat budgets. Plan S was making its way around Scalcom discussions in Europe, and I believe making some traction there. Institutions and consortia were starting to handle vendor and publisher negotiations differently, with attempts to negotiate in larger groups, different kinds of contracts, and arrangements such as transformative agreements. We're starting to make some headway. And of course, the UC system and Elsevier ended their negotiations at that point too. And all of these things led Angie and I to draft a survey to see what, if any, sea change we might be starting to see in these areas as a result of the landscape. Next slide, please. So this is a really basic overview of our survey responses. We sent out the survey in the fall of 2019, had about 136 responses, most of which came from larger doctoral institutions, but did include responses from smaller non-research colleges and universities as well. Caveats of note here to include, we did not control for the number of responses from each institution. We really wanted to take a deep dive as we could into kind of the feelings and the sentiments in these areas across the board. And of course, it was also administered pre-COVID, which means, of course, that attitudes and actions have likely shifted since then. The interesting thing for me, I think, will be to watch in what directions they shift, especially after this week. The four themes we pulled from the responses, in which Angie is going to go through in more detail, center around big deal cancellations. Are we doing them still and why? Communication around big deals and the unsustainable financial landscape that they create. Organizational structures and roles which support this type of work, and then finally the kinds of partnerships libraries are forming and leveraging in order to make change. And so at this point I will transfer over to Angie, and she will take you through some of these themes in more detail.
Thank you, Joelle. For our first theme, in terms of big deals, we really wanted to get library perspectives on the big deal at that time, fall of 2019. We asked our respondents to tell us if they thought the UC Elsevier divorce was something that they thought they could leverage for change. Most of our respondents told us it was simply too soon to tell. That said, 61% of our respondents told us they had already started breaking up big deals, some more dramatically than others. Of those who said they had not yet or had no plans to make changes in big deals, 67% of those were from doctoral level institutions. So why are they canceling, and what sort of changes are they making? For those who had reduced their big deals already, 53% said it was because they were unable to sustain journal inflation, and 23% told us it was because of mandated budget reductions. Where libraries were able to reallocate funding after breaking up a big deal, most were reinvesting that funding to offset the inflation on other existing subscriptions or to purchase collections they previously could not afford. Only about 17% were reallocating funding toward OA initiatives. In terms of our second theme, communication, this is where things got interesting. Nearly a quarter of our respondents told us that OA and big deal communication is shared across multiple library units, while not quite 10% told us it was handled in a dedicated unit, typically scholarly communications, collections units, technical services, or acquisitions. Many more respondents told us that communication was handled at some kind of administrative level in the libraries, library dean or director, director or head of collections, or an AD or AUL for collections. We wondered if those respondents who told us this was handled at an administrative level were also those who said it was shared across multiple units, meaning those initiatives were considered to be library-wide priorities. Surprisingly, this was not the case. For those who had answered that a library dean or director handles this communication, only 40% also said that it was shared across multiple library units. For those who said it was a director or head of collections, only about 34% also answered it was shared across the libraries. For AD or AUL for collections, only 22% said it was shared across the libraries. Further, for those who said it was a dedicated unit, only about 9% also said it was shared across the libraries. So why does this matter? When we looked at what respondents also reported about campus support for OA and big deal initiatives, we noticed that those respondents who indicated that OA and big deal communication was shared across multiple library units were also the same ones who indicated more success in terms of campus support. Campus OA policies, institutional copyright addendums, shared costs for APCs, campus support for ending big deals, and generally support for changing the way that libraries did business. Some of the disconnect here may be the way in which advocacy and communication stems from the library across campus. OA seems to have coalesced around university library councils, faculty senates, and individual academic departments, whereas big deal communication is often aimed at university library councils, faculty senates, and then a combination of inviting faculty to engage and lead on change issues through task groups, as well as engaging directly with campus administrations about the challenges of academic journal pricing. These are typically the purview of library administrators. The irony being that pushing out OA and big deal communication through multiple library units and multiple library personnel may actually meet with more success in terms of campus support. Our third theme, we asked if the library employs any personnel with the following titles: Scalcom librarian, collection development strategies librarian, copyright librarian, resource analyst, and we also left an option for other where they could write in and answer. And as you can see, we got 23% of our respondents wrote something in. That was 54 write-ins. Now, nearly half of those write-ins were some variation on collections, collection development, or collection management. The other half were clustered around personnel with titles that involved digital scholarship or liaison or subject to specialties of some kind. When we look further at this data, we saw that there may be different strategies emerging here for pairing complementary skills in terms of personnel. 1/3 of the respondents who indicated they have a scholarly communications librarian also indicated they had either a collection development strategies librarian or a copyright librarian, while only 12% of our respondents indicated they have all three of those positions. Sure, this could be a product of a difference in size between libraries in terms of personnel resources, but it could also be a difference in strategies. While the goal of the work in terms of a shift to open may be the same, it may be that one strategy is to emphasize traditional OA advocacy, while the other is deliberately partnering with collection development to re-envision the collections budget. When combined with results of our questions about communication, the structure for this work is very much in flux within libraries. That said, we believe that a greater degree of structural organization around open access initiatives and collection strategy should exist across the profession in order to move things forward in a more concerted way. Looking at our last theme, looking at our respondents' answers about campus support for change. There seems to be slightly more support for change on the part of campus administrations versus faculty. We think this explains some of the differences we saw in how libraries approach advocacy and partnerships between OA and big deal communications in terms of faculty collaboration. For OA, it's about advocacy for OA policies and resolutions more generally across campus and with academic departments. But for big deals, the goal seems to be more targeted partnerships and advocacy with university senates and university library councils. Libraries pivoting to conversations about changing the big deal are also twice as likely to invite faculty to lead task groups aimed at change. In terms of library as publisher, nearly 40% of the respondents said that their library has an IR or pursues cooperative partnerships with a university press. 21% pay full or part of the APCs for faculty authors, and 30% are investing in alternative publishing or OA initiatives. We asked respondents to tell us which ones they are participating in by name, and the top two were Open Textbook Network and Knowledge Unlatched, with Open Library of the Humanities, Spark, Tome, Scope 3, and Archive, and a host of others listed after that. Nearly 41% of our respondents told us they were participating in cooperative collection development through a consortia. Since our study, we've seen the rise in initiatives across campuses and across consortia to create shared infrastructure and shared advocacy. Examples of this are the MIT framework, library consortia statements endorsing transparency and sustainable pricing, and the cooperative initiative, infrastructure initiatives like the Big Ten Academic Alliance's Big Collection. We believe all of these are natural outcomes of libraries correctly perceiving that they must shift the marketplace around them by not only making changes in their own organizational structure and collection strategies, but also engaging in those same changes through their consortia and campus partnerships. In terms of the big takeaways from our study, we found that libraries who seem to be succeeding in shifting their organizational and operational focus engage in the following: long-term OA engagement and advocacy, especially when it comes to sustainable academic publishing; structural changes that accommodate new work, new units, new positions focused on creating and implementing new services and new initiatives; deliberately combining the power of the library's collections budget with scholarly communications advocacy; centering change and open access as an organizational priority, shared library-wide, and paired with a multifaceted marketing plan; and then lastly, collaborating with new and traditional partners in new ways. And I'm going to turn it back over to Joelle now.
Thank you. So, of course, the question, where do we go from here? We feel pretty strongly that the building blocks for change that we either learned or that were reinforced by the survey are not only still relevant in the COVID era going forward, they are incredibly important if we really intend to change in any kind of meaningful way. The first is an overall shift away from library as repository and towards the idea of library as institute, places where research collaboration and innovation happens, where the materials that we collect and subscribe to are actively used and embedded in academic programs and research initiatives, where part of the research and development that goes on in higher education is centered and connected. We also need to build up and leverage our shared infrastructure, which Angie mentioned earlier. I don't know of any academic libraries that didn't make use of the HathiTrust Emergency Access Program at some point since March, and it's just one example of the kind of shared infrastructure that we're talking about. Dr. Lewis, in his keynote this morning, used the term academic commons, common market, and if you haven't seen his keynote yet, I highly encourage you to watch it because it was fabulous. The bottom line here is that we've got to stop trying to recreate the wheel at our respective libraries and focus actively on creating sustainable shared infrastructure. We also need to leverage the pandemic where we can to drive home the point that open science and open sharing of research more generally is critical to our collective health and well-being. Many publishers opened up access to their COVID-related articles over the last few months, but what about open access to the myriad other issues that impact us in our world? COVID, I think, and Angie, I think, is with me here, has revealed how desperately we need to work towards open and how we need to run with it while we have the chance. Another is the need to align our collection strategies with the open initiatives that we are championing. We need to put our money where our mouth is, but we also need to ensure that our scholarly communication conversations are happening in tandem with our collection development and acquisitions conversations. Some university libraries, MIT is a notable example, are merging their ScholComm and collections departments so that this work can happen kind of more naturally and organically within the organizational structure itself. We need to re-envision our spaces. Many libraries have already started this process over the last 10 to 15 years, but one thing that I think has become crystal clear over the last 8 months is that we don't need a giant building full of books in order to serve our campus communities. Print usage has gone down steadily for 10 years, and now is the time to carefully curate our print collections and clear out the rest of it to make room for new use spaces. And finally, we need to do all of the above quickly. We cannot rely on the glacial pace that we are used to moving in higher ed and hope to be able to make change. We should consider employing agile or lean methods to quickly spin up new services or initiatives and iterate them as we deploy them. Rapid prototyping is one such approach that I like to utilize, and one that Angie and I will be talking about in more detail on November 17th in our workshop titled Prototyping for Progress. So I'd encourage you to join us then for a deeper dive into this particular method of approaching change. But right now, what I'd like to do is walk us through kind of where we are going as a group, and I will go ahead and bring up our survey results and we can take a look at that together. Okay, so it looks like we had about 66 responses. We tried to keep this as short as possible and hopefully we'll have some takeaways here that are meaningful for us. So I will walk through these and we'll see if we can draw some conclusions. The first question was, how has your approach to big deals changed since the start of the pandemic, or has it changed? It looks like for the vast majority, we're staying the course, which makes total sense to me in the current landscape that we are surviving in right now. But a good third, or almost a third of us, are changing our approach to big deals, which I think is very interesting. And we have a few write-ins here. We're considering options. We're rethinking big deals, but not because of the pandemic. Interesting. Okay. Oops. Have you or are you considering negotiating a transformative agreement since the start of the pandemic? Let's see. It looks like yes, the vast majority, interestingly enough, is currently negotiating or is considering negotiating a transformative agreement since the pandemic began. A lot of folks are no, a lot of folks are maybe, again, not surprising. And this is also not surprising, kind of starting the process before the pandemic, finishing it during the pandemic. We at CMU are engaged in several of these transformative agreement conversations, and they continue to roll out. Okay, let's see here. Has the pandemic forced your library to give up open positions or otherwise reduce your budget? Yep. I think a lot of us are in the same boat here. Almost everybody is hurting in terms of the financial side, the operations side, and sometimes the collection side. It looks like about 75% of us have had to reduce our collections budget. Layoffs or furloughs. A number of us have had to engage in these activities, which is always just a hit to morale in addition to everything else that's going on. Reduction of time and effort spent on open access initiatives. I'm really actually pleasantly surprised to see this as the lowest response in this category. I think that kind of speaks to our hope that we can continue this work not only during the pandemic, but after it goes away. And where are you going from here? So we were hopeful that we could just get a sense of the overall directions that our peers and our colleagues are going in at this point, or at least considering going in. And it looks like the top response here is altering communication strategies around open access and big deals. So it sounds like, if nothing else, we're talking about what our strategies and approaches are to how we will handle this going forward. Engaging differently with faculty is the next highest response. I think that is perfectly reflected in the survey results that Angie and I have combed through over the last few months. Those institutions who actively engage with their faculty are reporting, at least, that they are more successful in their open access initiatives with the faculty support. Relying more heavily on consortial bargaining is in here a number of times, and then creating open access policies. So it sounds like we are still heading, maybe not full steam ahead, but with enough momentum that we are still hoping that we can make some change. All right, I'm going to stop share here. And I think we have just a couple of minutes left to answer questions, and we would love to hear what you think and answer any outstanding questions that you have. And I believe, Judy, you're going to pull a few from the chat for us.
Well, there was just one, there were just two questions, one comment and one question. The comment was that some people couldn't see the link for the survey, so I put that into the chat. And then, you know, Karen commented while you were going through your results, can afford not to unbundle and deploy fewer funds. But I didn't get any other questions.
Judy, I do see that there was a question on the pathable side. How do you encourage libraries to put savings toward OA initiatives rather than towards covering expenses toward other acquisitions? And that's an excellent question. Okay. I think from the data that we saw in our survey, I think it depends on your larger strategy and where you're making those connections. It seemed like those libraries that were moving in the direction of partnering their scholarly communications advocacy with their collection development strategies are the libraries that are trying to make room there for reinvesting funding in those OA initiatives. But it definitely has to be a library-wide priority, and it clearly needs to be something that is coordinated, as well as something that is marketed and embraced by our faculty and our campus constituents.
I would add too that this is a role for the director or the dean too, to have these kinds of conversations with the provost and the CFO and the other upper administrators of the university, so that they know you are actively setting these as a priority, as a strategic path that the libraries are taking. And so that when the funds are doled out, they are clearly on board, hopefully, with your plan, and can augment in a meaningful way when those funds are diverted to open initiatives.
Right.
Are there other questions?
They didn't, the pathable side didn't come up here. No, I only have the chat part, and there were no other questions.
All right. Well, thank you all for attending today. We are really excited about our workshop here in a couple of weeks, and we'd invite you to join us there to talk about how we can apply rapid prototyping to change management within the OA sphere, SCOLCOM sphere. And then we'll also be publishing the results of our survey in a more in-depth way coming up here in the next few months. So thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so